Thank you, Jan. One point of entry into late century sensibilities is Paul Verlaine's Fête Galante, a set of 22 poems that evoke refined delights of the French Ancien Régime, of Watteau and Fête Champêtre, of Marivaux and the Maskers of Commedia dell'arte, of midnight serenades, rich pavilions, and sensual love. In Verlaine's treatment, however, corruption and disenchantment undermine every pleasure. His ingénues are beginners, boys, who encounter prostitutes that shock them with their whispered words. His marquises and priests are drunken and mad. Melancholy, fed by a bittersweet nostalgia that looks to a time long out of reach, suffuses the collection. The final poem, Colloque Sentimental, is a desolate exchange between former lovers who wish to forget their past happiness. One of them says, "Hope has fled, crushed into the black sky." The opening lines of the collection's first poem, Clair de Lune, raise the possibility that everything to follow has played out in the inner world of the soul. Your soul is a choice landscape where masks and bergamasques pass entrancing, playing lutes and dancing, slightly sad in their strange costumes. Critics have traced the precedents and impact of Fête Galante by and large from within a literary frame. Antoine Adam typifies this approach in his classic work, The Art of Paul Verlaine, enumerating other French writers who treated seduction and disguise, including Banville, Gautier, de Musset, Hugo, and the Goncourt brothers. In Adam's telling, the flood doesn't altogether drown Verlaine, but the effect is to dilute and to diminish. There is hint of reproof when Adam declares that the more one studies Fête Galante, the clearer it becomes that it is impossible to explain the book by the Watteau interpretation. The conclusion is surely right, but this is beside the point. Despite their old regime trappings, the poems themselves suggest that the landscape of muted despair is thoroughly 19th century. Fête Galante appeared in 1869 with a run of 350 copies. It was little noticed and went quietly out of print. When the collection was reissued in 1887, it was hailed as having been 20 years ahead of its time. Its fragmented, spare, atmospheric style found ready imitators in young writers and artists eager to oppose the dominant school of naturalism. Fête Galante is of its own time in another respect. Its evocation of masks is as far from the 18th century's decorous masquerades as it is from the tumultuous masked balls of the July monarchy. Verlaine's maskers, sad in their strange costumes and singing in the minor mode, are his contemporaries. For many of this generation, the mask had become a figure for existential uncertainty. Earlier in the century, the mask's associations had already begun to widen from a tool of revelry or disguise or hypocrisy to a figure for the face or the person or the persona. La Comédie Humaine, a sculpture by Ernest Christophe, attracted the attention of Baudelaire, who described it in an 1859 poem that would later appear in Les Fleurs du Mal. Why does she cry? This perfect beauty who could bring vanquished humanity itself to her feet? What strange sickness erodes her robust loins? She weeps, you fool, because she has lived, and because she lives. Above all, what she laments, what causes her to shudder to her very soul, is that tomorrow, alas, she still must live. Tomorrow, and the next day, and always, as we too must. Here the mask is not hypocrisy to be exposed or revealed. It is, as Baudelaire wrote in an essay on Christophe's work, the universal mask, your mask, my mask, a mask with which art colludes to hide our suffering from others and ourselves. The suggestion is that unnatural distortions are becoming permanent. If so, the public face may be detached from the private self. In 1883, the sculptor Zachary Estruc called his enigmatic tribute to 11 great artists, poets, and novelists Le Marchand de Masques, a work that still stands in the Luxembourg Gardens. A boy holds Victor Hugo's head aloft. At one time, he held in his other hand Jean-Baptiste Faure, who was an operatic singer, Charles Gounod, and Théodore de Banville. And those masks at his feet include Camille Claudel, Berlioz, Dumas, and Balzac. The frontispiece to Félicien Chamseur's Masque Moderne, a book of literary essays and sketches, takes a similar approach. The image, done by the artist Félicien Rops, features a naked woman with a Phrygian bonnet and a jester's doll holding the crenellated, steaming head of the author Chamseur himself. Is she meant to evoke Judith or Salome or Circe? Masks line the wall and table. Just below the shelf, closest to the woman's belly, a leering Gustave Flaubert. Near the curve of her back with small spectacles, Émile Zola. Above him and to the left, Alphonse Daudet, and above him, Dumas fils. The book itself offers literary portraits of these authors, which Chamseur defines as masks. 7 years later, in 1896, the critic Rémy de Gourmont published the first of his 2-volume Livre des Masques, following the same model, with short impressions of his subjects' lives rather than developed essays. De Gourmont's book was illustrated with abstracted, minimalist, mask-like woodcuts by Félix Vallotton. This is Verlaine, this is Rimbaud, Maurice Barrès, Maeterlinck, and Claudel. There are many others in this book as well. De Gourmont denied that his portraits and prose were criticism, calling them instead psychological analysis. He writes, "We no longer have principles or models. A writer creates his own aesthetic in creating his work. Therefore, we must appeal more to sensation than to judgment." The proliferation of masks as a figure for the face or persona corresponds with their gradual disappearance as a physical object. By 1850, the commercial masked balls across Paris that had enjoyed such fantastic success during the July monarchy were decidedly less popular. This decline was a sharp contrast to entertainments of the 1830s and early 1840s. In 1836, for example, the police announced that there were some 180 public balls and more than 850 private balls being held on Mardi Gras, most of them involving some element of disguise. Masked balls in the July monarchy were an exaggerated version of the tremendous changes that transformed social hierarchies when fortunes were made in sudden windfalls and just as quickly lost. During these years in Paris, the rich dressed as rag pickers and thieves, and laundry girls came as aristocrats. The wealthy attended for the thrill of rubbing shoulders with supposed outlaws. The middling went to emulate or perhaps mock their betters. The less fortunate took the occasion to imagine themselves in another role. Masks brought otherwise remote worlds together, and the encounter was not always peaceful. Parisian Carnival in these years was more provocation than play, more subversive than controlled, more expressive of hostility than fellow feeling. Observers offered explanations for the declining popularity of masks and masked balls around mid-century. Some noted political changes, but there was no consensus on their effect. Just before Louis Napoleon's coup, a journalist wrote, "The coming of liberty has given birth to a new respect for others, and this respect, which has spread to a new regard for oneself, has brought an end to the taste for disguise." A more cynical voice from the mid-1850s spoke of a kind of sham equality that did not require physical masks to deceive others. He writes, "Today we no longer have classes or faces or characters or moral constraints. now that money is the sole mark of nobility or distinction, now that the mask of money disfigures every face and all are free to disguise themselves to play their little comedy, what good is carnival? Carnival is dead. A masked, disguised, made-up, papered-over civilization has buried it. Carnival late in the century saw few masks. Sidewalk pranks and insults that had characterized earlier decades were largely absent, replaced by a seemly exchange of confetti. Accounts of balls for the rest of the century report a dreary sameness. Genuine disguise gives way to costumes. Most men choose to come in a black suit and tie, and women are usually the only ones masked, a condition for their entry to the opera ball and to a number of others. The legendary sexual license of earlier decades increasingly became a business proposition. As masking slipped from public view, the mask as a figure for anxiety and dissolution spread through French culture. Among its more garish uses were those employed by the decadent writer Jean Lorraine, for whom the mask was a portal into the dream world of violence, perversion, and terror. For Lorraine's characters, and by all indications Lorraine himself, masks are at once overpowering and repulsive, as he writes in his collection Histoire de Masque from 1900, the turbid, troubling face of the unknown. Continuing, they are lust laced with fear, the delicious and tormenting risk embraced on a dare from one's curious senses. For Lorraine, masks are not a disguise to defy or efface social difference. They are a teller of truths better left unrevealed. In his story Chez l'une d'elles, a man describes coming upon a solitary masker staring into the Seine on a cold February night. The opera's masked ball has just ended. The masker, shivering, with legs bare, with slippers, a thin gray coat, a woolen shawl, is likely considering suicide. The man approaches, urges the masker to come with him, and offers his arm, which the figure seizes, rubbing its bare legs against the man's thighs and soliciting him from behind a silk mask with unmistakable insistence. They are now arm in arm. The man suggests they find a hotel. The masker names one on the Rue Gilles-le-Coeur. The man picks up the scene. It was in an alley that was so foul-smelling and dark, a lamp sputtering at the base of the stairs, that I stopped dead as if on the doorstep of an assassin. "No," I said to this creature, "I will never enter there." And then she said, with a voice caressing and unerring, "Go on, enter. There is no danger. I am the hotel boy here." To the narrator of another story in the collection, the faces of prostitutes, heavily made up and impassive, are more mask-like than human. And for the title character in Lorraine's novel Monsieur de Phocas, 1901, this sense spreads to every face he sees, and with gathering horror he cannot banish thoughts of decapitation. Phocas begins a journal entry, April 1893. Masks, I see them everywhere. The horrible vision last night of a deserted city filled with all its masked cadavers at doorways, a morphine ether nightmare that has implanted itself within me. I see masks in the streets. I see them on stage at the theater. I find them again in the box seats. They are in the balcony. They are in the orchestra. Everywhere, masks all around me. The ushers who hand me my overcoat wear a mask. Maskers show themselves outside at the exit, and the coachman who drives me home has this same cardboard grimace affixed to his face. It is probably unnecessary to observe that Lorraine's sensibility was unusual. Nervous and subject to terrors, addicted to ether, tempted by suicide, an expert about prostitutes who specialized in uncommon tastes and their clients, he likely lived many of his own fictions. But he was not unique in using the mask as a figure for human derangement and depravity. For Félicien Rops, the artist whose frontispiece de Chanseur's Masque Moderne evokes decapitation, the mask is also allied with morbid, often misogynistic eroticism. In hypocrisy, the age-old trope is unambiguous. But his work, Ecce Diabolo Mulieres, carries a similar message in a more sinister register. Unclothed, holding a mask in her hand, this diabola mulier, this she-devil, is not yet unmasked. Such is the warning this transparent skirt seems to give. Others in the Fin-de-Siècle use the mask to evoke mental illness. In the sculptor Pierre-Félix Massot's L'Emprise from 1894, whose title might be rendered Stranglehold, hideous faces seem to emanate from within a crouching figure who is unable to repulse them. It is difficult to know how widespread such conceptions might have been. A newspaper notice about a costume ball at the Salpêtrière Hospital in 1881 articulates a similar association. Over 300 women attended the ball, the account reads, whose costumes produced an unnatural peace. Quote, the mood and comportment of the dancers was so calm, so apparently reasonable, that it took the presence of the doctors Le Grand Dussart and Voisin to remind us that we were in the presence of hysterics and epileptics, that they were, in a word, the famous subjects of Dr. Charcot, end quote. By the end of the century, when the Belgian artist James Ensor embarked on a series of paintings in which faces take on the appearance of masks, the objects association had little to do with either festivity or carnivalesque role reversals. It was instead the expression of a haunted, corrupt, and degenerate civilization. For Ensor, modern life is a perpetual carnival of the mad and the depraved. As Verlaine had done in his Fête Galante 3 decades earlier, Ensor depicted this new world with figures from an unrecoverable past whose masks, formerly the vehicle of fantasy and play, now signaled degeneration. Around the time of his Fête Galante, Paul Verlaine wrote a poem called Pierrot, which did not appear in print until 1882. It reads in part, he is no longer the moonstruck dreamer from olden days who mocks his betters in the upper portals. His joy, alas, like his candle, is dead, and his ghost haunts us today, thin and clear. There he stands in a shock of light. His pale shirt, blown open in the cold wind, looks like a shroud, and his mouth gapes as if screaming from the sting of maggots. What broad conclusions can we draw from this sketch of masks in the later decades of the 19th century? What accounts for this shift in connotations toward the sickly and the unsettling? I'll offer 3 observations which might help us to frame these large changes. The first is that many of the cultural expressions we have considered fall under the general label of symbolism, the movement whose writers and artists aim to express the inexpressible by means of bizarre metaphors and images. Opposed to the accessible journalistic style of Zola and explicitly anti-democratic, symbolists sought refuge from the present by turning inward. Rémy de Grosmont, whose Livre des Masques featured Vallotton's woodcuts, disavowed all influence from earlier styles. He invoked Schopenhauer's view that the world was the representation of our will to express his contempt for naturalism's what he called muddy, tumultuous lyricism. Vallotton's woodcut masks were a similar rejection of photographic precision for willed representation. Masks evoked the unknown, unconscious realm symbolists cultivated. A second observation is that these new connotations of masks and the symbolists' project more generally rested on a developing understanding of the human psyche. Jean-Martin Charcot's experiments with hypnotism at the Salpêtrière, publicized through his regular Friday morning demonstrations, captured the attention of writers, intellectuals, artists, and the general public more broadly. His and others' work on hysteria, obsessions, phobias, and second personalities disseminated ideas about a vast unknown region of the psyche accessible only in glimpses and by inference. If masks in the July monarchy gave revelers a way to imagine themselves in a different place on the social scale, late century views of the self widened the possibilities. They now opened a way to question one's deepest identity. This may be related to a final observation. The turbulence of masked balls of the 1830s and 40s owed in part to a perception that genuine social mobility was possible. The rhetoric of the time, and to some extent the reality, embraced careers open to merit. The social landscape of the Second Empire and Third Republic was, by contrast, largely static. The appeal of hiding one's face and dressing out of station was decidedly weaker when the promise of real advancement was remote. Conformity prevailed at balls late in the century, and rather than disguise, it brought a kind of anti-carnivalesque imposture. In the late 1860s, for example, when men began to appear at the opera ball wearing formal evening attire, costume shops in the area did a brisk business renting out black suits to shopkeepers and workers who couldn't otherwise afford them, which they wore without a mask. Inequality encourages masking, while equality, genuine, or as the mid-century commentator observed, sham, causes it to disappear from view. But the story of masking over the centuries shows that its eclipse did not mean its absence. Its presence in the cultural imagination of late-century writers, artists, and intellectuals signified the complex work it performed, announcing a culture's decline, revealing corruption within, and suggesting the private worlds that offered an anxious relief from reality.
We will hear next from John.